11. Revelation chapter 11. Then there was given me, that would be John, a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, "Get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it." We were looking at the temple and we considered other theories and came to the conclusion that this is the temple on earth in Jerusalem, which has at that point been rebuilt. And we talked about the court given to the nations and came to the conclusion it's probably the court of the Gentiles as it was identified in earlier times. And then we looked at the altar that was included that he was to measure, and we concluded that this would be the brazen altar, even though all the other references to the altar in the book of Revelation are to the golden altar. This one is different in that it is on the earth, whereas the golden altar that's been referenced has been in heaven each time. And the people seem to have access to this altar. And the other thing we have to conclude from this portion is that the temple has been rebuilt. We're not told of the rebuilding. We're not told when it took place, but it seems that the temple has been rebuilt and that there are animal sacrifices being made there. Now that troubles many people because clearly the book of Hebrews teaches us that we don't depend upon animal sacrifices because of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. One sacrifice forever, never needing to be repeated. And yet, not only here, but also in the book of Ezekiel, we have a reference to animal sacrifices which are at this time still future. In Ezekiel chapters 40 and following, we have the description in detail of a temple. He was given a measuring rod and he measured it out, and unlike this report in Revelation, the measurements were told us. And from those measurements and other historical documents, we know that the temple that Ezekiel was describing was not like any other temple that has existed up until today. So we conclude that it is a future temple. Not only that, but this temple in Ezekiel, specifically chapter 40, verses 39 and following, references the animal sacrifices. It talks about the tables that are there, and they are there for the purpose of preparing the sacrifices. So it's a temple which is today still future, and it's a temple which has animal sacrifices. So you think, okay, now what are we going to do with that? Can we think that there is an altar, a brazen altar, being described by John in the book of Revelation on earth where there are animal sacrifices being made? And there are two answers to that. One is that this altar would still be unbelieving Jews at the time of the first half of the tribulation. And unbelieving Jews don't believe that Jesus Christ has made the one sacrifice, and they would be quite eager to have animal sacrifices once again. So it's quite to be expected that in Israel's way of thinking, animal sacrifices would have been restored at this time, and they would want to make them. The other answer is that in Ezekiel 40's case, there would be future animal sacrifices as a memorial. No one would think of them as making the actual sacrifice to take away sins. They would recognize them as being memorial in character. And we partook of the Lord's Supper this morning, and none of us think that's an actual re-sacrifice of Jesus Christ. That is a memorial, but there are people who do something similar, and they say that it is actually Christ and that he's being re-sacrificed every time that takes place. That's the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. So there are very, very many people who are thinking that that is an actual sacrifice of Jesus Christ over again. We don't accept that, but we do certainly accept that we need to do the Lord's Supper, and we do it as a memorial. And there's really absolutely nothing to say that they can't make a memorial sacrifice to look back. We certainly wouldn't want to sacrifice an animal. Now we like the way that God gave us to memorialize. But for the Jews, memorializing by an animal sacrifice would be the most natural thing of all. So, two reasons why animal sacrifices are perfectly to be expected at this time. The first is you're dealing with unbelieving Jews who have had their temple restored, and the reason they need the temple is the animal sacrifices, and of course they would have animal sacrifices. And the other is that animal sacrifices, once they're saved, if they're still able to make those, and perhaps they're not, would be of a memorial character. Very possibly the covenant with the prince, the Antichrist, would have enabled them to rebuild the temple and have the sacrifices. So, why do you suppose God prepared for us a record of the fact that they measured the temple and didn't give us any measurements? Why would he tell us that John was given a rod and he measured the temple, he measured the altar, he measured that much, but he did not measure the court of the Gentiles? Why would he give us that record? Obviously, it's not so that we can know what the dimensions are, because he didn't give us those. So we suppose that it was to mark the possession, because God treasured. And it marks out a possession and a non-possession. Now, that's not quite the right idea. God possesses everything, right? But he makes a distinction here between the court of the Gentiles, because the Gentiles are going to tread it underfoot. Well, let's read verse 2. We haven't read it yet. Leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. The reason he doesn't measure that court is because it's been given to the nations. It's been given to the Gentiles. We're going to talk about that as different views as to what the nations are here in a moment. But he leaves that out. But the portion he measures then by implication is the portion that is given to the Jews and not to the Gentiles. And that makes it more precious to God, because the Jewish people are precious to God. The profane is not measured, it's left out. The sacred is measured and is kept in. Leave it out. The Greek word is one I enjoyed learning. Now, I didn't enjoy learning many Greek words. Probably why I didn't do a particularly good job of it, but I didn't like the idea of having to memorize these things. But to throw was balo. And you understand why I like that word. That was an easy one to remember. Balo, I throw. And this is ekbalo, I throw out. And of course the translation here is not thrown out, it's leave out the court. The same word, ekbalo, is used in Luke 4:29. And they got up and drove him out of the city. Drove him out is ekbalo. What were they doing? They were throwing him out. So there's a measure of antagonism in the use of this word ekbalo, leave out the court, which is outside the temple. And do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Has been given to the nations is a Greek aorist passive. Aorist is the spot action, and the passive says they're not taking it, it's been given to them, been given to the nations. The nations are passive in the transaction. It has been given. Has been given sounds like the perfect tense, if you're familiar with these things, and I mention them quite often, so you might be. Has been given, if it were in the perfect tense, would be saying to us, it was given in the past and it still stands in the possession as a result of that having been given. This is not that perfect tense. This is an aorist passive, and it's an aorist passive of a term which is generally used for rejection. Spot action, it was given to them, we're not going to measure it, it's done and over with. So God has abandoned the court outside the temple to the Gentiles. It means that they have access to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to destroy it. Before, the court of the Gentiles was a place where people could come and worship God. They could approach to God. But in this new development, it's not for people to come and approach to God, and they are rejected, and it is rejected. So leaving it unmeasured amounts to a rejection from God's favor. The temple, the altar, and the worshipers are measured, and in this context, that means they are favored by God. And though the temple is measured as God's possession, it is in fact desecrated by Antichrist from this point to the end of the tribulation. So the outer court is not measured, it's trampled underfoot, but the part that God has measured is going to be in what we would think of as being trampled underfoot also. You follow me there? Daniel 9 verse 27. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. This would be the prince, this would be the Roman prince, the Antichrist. He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. In the middle of the week. Now this week, we've talked about it many times, it's a week of 7 years. It's a 7, it's a week, but it's not a week of days, it's a week of years. And stop to sacrifice in the middle of the week would be how far in? 3.5 years. 3.5 years happens to be 42 months and also 1,260 days. It's referred to all three of those ways. But here, it's just the middle of the week. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So, The Antichrist is going to put a stop to the sacrifices that the Jews have been able to make in the first half of the tribulation in the temple, and I think pursuant to the covenant that they had made. He's going to put a stop to it halfway. He's a covenant cheater. He's not going to do what he promised to do. Then in Daniel 12, verse 11, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. It's the same as 42 months, the same as the 3.5 years, 1,290 days. The months in prophecy are always 30 days long. So when you get 42 months and you multiply it times 30, you get 1,260, because all of those months were 30 days long. And he says from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished. And so the Antichrist is abolishing the sacrifice, and that means that he has got his fingers into the things that are going on in the area that God has measured. God has measured, that area is particular to him, it's precious to him, but the Antichrist is not going to be prevented from going in there and messing with it. As a matter of fact, he's going to set up the abomination of desolation. He's going to put up something in the holy place in the temple, which is an abomination, and that abomination causes things to go desolate, because God judges that irreverent use of his very special holy place. So that leaves us thinking about the outside court. It's not measured. It's given over to the Gentiles, and they're going to trample it underfoot for this 3.5 years. The inside is measured, it's precious to God, but the Antichrist is going to come in, and for those 3.5 years, he's going to make an abomination of desolation in there. So it's not a difference in whether the Gentiles have access to it or not. It's a difference in God's attitude concerning the spaces involved, even though the Antichrist is going to do bad things in all of those spaces. So, what nations? Our verse say that the nations are given the outer court. What nations are there? Some people say the nations are the nations over which Christ will reign during the millennium. These nations are here at the midpoint of the millennium. They're going to trample it underfoot, but Christ will reign over them in the millennium. That's what this view holds. There's a problem with this view, though, because in Revelation 19:21, all of those nations are destroyed. So if these nations are destroyed, they're not going to go on into the millennium to be a part of the scene there. So that view just is wrong on the face of it. The nations are not those over which Christ will reign during the millennium. Another proposal for identifying the nations is that it's all who are outside Christ, Jew or Gentile, Jew or non-Jew. Everybody outside Christ is the nations, and those who are born again, those who are saved, that's not the nations. That's the distinction that they hold to. That proposal is made by folks who want to say that the temple is the church. They say that the temple here is not a building in Jerusalem. It's not the holy temple there. It's the church. It's a spiritual reference to the church that is being made here. And so the church is the temple, and it's the people who are being blessed. And the Jews are kind of out, they're out of the picture. They're not important anymore. If a Jew believes, he's part of the church. Well, that's certainly true, isn't it, today? And if he doesn't believe, according to them, he would be part of the nations. But the Jews are still being distinguished and blessed during the book of Revelation. We saw that in chapter 7, the 144,000. Every single one of them was sealed because they were one of the Jews. So God hasn't just lumped them together into the church. He's holding to a distinction. This is the time of Jacob's trouble. It's the way it's described in the Old Testament, the time of Jacob's trouble. And it's the time of Jacob's trouble. You got to have Jacob around. And that's what we have here. So this idea that the nations are all who are outside Christ, including Jews, won't float either. That just doesn't work. So, who are the nations? They're the people who are not Jews. It's the nations as opposed to the Jews. They rebel against God. They work mayhem in Jerusalem. They trample down the court of the Gentiles, which is no longer special to God. And they are going to be destroyed at the end of the millennium. What's the holy city? The nations, we've just described what they are. What is the holy city? Somebody says it is the heavenly Jerusalem. After all, only the heavenly Jerusalem could be said to be truly holy. But the heavenly Jerusalem doesn't come until the new creation. It's after these things are all over with and it comes down out of heaven from God, and it's not here on the earth until then. And this holy city is on the earth. It's going through these things. So we're going to reject that idea. It's proposed that the holy city is false Christianity. It's the people who think of themselves as being holy. They're Christians, but they've been invaded by the world and they are ungodly, and therefore they are the holy city because of external appearance, but not really holy because they don't follow God faithfully. But that idea is built upon a symbolic understanding of the temple and the holy city. They want to make the city this false Christianity because they don't want to have a place for the Jews, and they want to spiritualize it. And the curious thing is, it says the temple is the church, and the city is the church. As the city, it's going to be trampled underfoot, and as the temple, it's going to be favored by God. And they just, it's not practical to try to make that thing work. So our conclusion is the holy city is earthly Jerusalem. The temple is on earth. The city has to be on earth also. The usage of holy city throughout the Bible refers to Jerusalem throughout the Bible. And furthermore, in our own passage, chapter 11, verse 8, the holy city is the one where Christ was crucified. That nails it down. This is Jerusalem. An objection to that idea is that Rome destroyed Jerusalem 25 years before this was written. So it couldn't be Jerusalem because it was destroyed before this. What's wrong with that idea? Rebuilt, that's right, it's back. This is talking about things that are still future to us today. What happened to Jerusalem millenniums back is not germane to whether or not this can be the holy city. So the holy city here is Jerusalem. How about the 42 months? People want to make the 42 months symbolic. It's a symbol. It doesn't mean 1,260 days. It doesn't mean 42 literal months. It's a symbol. It's based upon the idea that most numbers in the book of Revelation are symbolic. They're not real numbers. But really that hasn't been established. They've been consistent in claiming that pretty much all the way through, but they really haven't proven it. There's no evidence for that it's symbolic. There's no significant support for that symbolic idea. And those who want to make it symbolic fall into two camps. One is the 42 months is derogatory because it's 6 times 7. Now, I don't know why 6 times 7 is derogatory, but that's their viewpoint. They say, this is derogatory, this is a bad thing. The 42 months is bad. But others who take the symbolic view say the 42 months is good because it's messianic, because it's 3 times 14, and 14 is the number of the consonants in David's name when you take their numerical value. Well, you know, if you're going to make it symbolic, you can make it pretty much whatever you want to make it. My conclusion, the 42 months is 42 months, right. It is equal to a time times and half a time. That's from Daniel. Time times and half a time. A time is a year. Times are 2 years, and half a time is half a year, 3.5 years. It equals 1,260 days, since months in prophecy are 30 days long, and 30 times 42 is 1,260. And this is the last half of the tribulation period. Well, it's 3.5 years, and the tribulation period 7 years long, but why call it the last half of the tribulation period? Well, because we've already seen all of the seals and all of the trumpets before this came up. And that suggests that we are into the last half, not the first half. The temple was measured as precious to God at this point. And it's a special measure like the 2 witnesses. It does not prevent the Antichrist from desecrating the altar. During the times of the Gentiles tread the holy city underfoot, but the Jews had it the first half of the tribulation, and this is the second half, and the Gentiles are treading it underfoot. God's favor on one and disfavor on the other is implied. His favor on the measured is seen in the 2 witnesses. And we're going to look at them, and of course we know that they're favored because of the miracles they can do and the way their lives are preserved. His disfavor is seen on those who oppose them, in that they can become human flamethrowers and take care of those who want to kill them. So this difference pertains to the remainder of the 70th week. So the nations profaned Jerusalem for 42 months. Luke 21:24, as a parallel passage, says this: "And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So Jerusalem's going to be trampled underfoot until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Times of the Gentiles started with the Babylonian captivity. The Gentiles came in and destroyed the city. Babylon did that. And then after 70 years, the Jews could return, but the supreme authority, their government, was the government of Gentiles. And first it was the Medes and the Persians over Jerusalem and Israel, and then it was the Greeks who ruled over them, and then it was the Romans who ruled over them, and the Romans sacked the city and sent them packing. And then for, 1800 years, something like that, there were several different groups that fought back and forth over the city and trampled it and did all kinds of things. And you come up to the time of Christ, and who's in charge? The Romans are in charge. They're still in charge. And then during the Dark Ages after that, 1500s and on, the Gentiles have the city. Now we're coming back, and Israel has come back, but they are still under the thumb of the Gentiles. They have to make a league with the Antichrist in order to rebuild their temple. And we're reading about the fact that they are going to be under the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. They'll be fulfilled after these 42 months, after these 1,260 days. And then the times of the Gentiles will be over at that point. Israel will be restored to Jerusalem and temple worship, but it's still the time of the Gentiles in the second half of the tribulation. Two witnesses, Revelation 11:3. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Okay, now we've got a lot of things that are going 1,260 days, don't we? Or 42 months, or whatever. And these two witnesses are going for the same period of time as the rest of these things that are being carried on. The word "and," Revelation 11:3, and I will grant authority to my two witnesses. That's tied to the measuring of the temple. So John is given the rod, and he measures the temple, and I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy. And he measures the temple, and it said that it's going to be trampled, the city's going to be trampled by the Gentiles for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy. So the measuring is tied to the witness, and they're both for the same period of time, though it is described as months in one case and days in the other case. It calls the witnesses my two witnesses. Who's speaking for my two witnesses? It would be God. They belong to God. God is speaking. He grants the authority. I will grant authority to my two witnesses. And the two witnesses are needed. Why? They are needed to establish a fact. In Scripture, if you were in court and it was a serious matter, I'm not sure, certainly if it was a death penalty matter, you had to have two witnesses. Couldn't do it. If you didn't have two eyewitnesses at that time, and the fellow was guilty, he'd get off because you didn't have two eyewitnesses. You had to have those two witnesses. And in Matthew 18:16, you had to bring two witnesses in matters of church discipline. You had to bring in 2 or 3 witnesses. And it was required by Paul to establish judgment. 2 Corinthians 13:1. This is the third time I'm coming to you. Every fact is to be confirmed by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So this has been a principle in the Old Testament. It's a principle in the New Testament. You got to have 2 witnesses. And God's going to have himself 2 witnesses to himself, to his power, to his glory, to his right to the earth. And these 2 witnesses are going to be there, and nobody is going to kill them or get rid of them for 3.5 years. They're going to be there during the worst part of the tribulation period. So who are these 2 witnesses? Well, there are always people who want to spiritualize things, right? And for some people, the 2 witnesses are the church. Now, the church is not 2 people, you understand. But they say, look, In chapter 1, the church was represented by lampstands, and there were only 7 of those. And if 7 lampstands can represent the church, then 2 witnesses can represent the church. It's the church, these 2 witnesses. And besides that, who can imagine the beast is going to make war against just 2 witnesses? Just 2 people? Come on, you don't have to wage war against just 2 people. And besides that, it says that their death is seen worldwide. If it's just 2 people, how can they be seen worldwide when they're killed? But the church, it's all over the world, and you can see that being killed off all over the world. So this represents the church. And of course, there's an assumption of symbolism for the passage, and it's just that. It's an assumption. It's not established. Rebuttal. They wear sackcloth. 2 witnesses wearing sackcloth. Sackcloth is worn by what kind of being? Human being, individuals, yes, not a church. It's plural. They will prophesy. If it was the church, it would be singular. And verse 5, fire comes out of their mouths. Probably not the church. Probably 2 individuals. And then having the whole church be martyred, what happens to these witnesses at the end? They're killed, come back to life, and they raised into heaven. Well, if this is the church, you've got a major problem there. Because if they are raised into heaven at the end, who is going to populate the earth for the new millennium? Because they've been killed and raised back into heaven. They're not on the earth. And you know that the people on the earth for the millennium are still having children. That's a very important fact concerning the millennium. So we're going to reject the idea that it is the church. It doesn't work out. Another proposal, and this one's very common, is that this is Enoch and Elijah. Enoch and Elijah. Both of them were taken to heaven without dying. But the scripture says, it is given unto man once to die, and then the judgment. So it has to be people who went to heaven without dying, because they're going to die in this time in the tribulation at the end. Therefore, it has to be Enoch and Elijah. This was the view of the early church. Such people as Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Hippolytus all held to this view. It's going to be Enoch and Elijah. However, is it necessary for all men to die once? Is that what that verse means? And if it is necessary, what about the saints who are alive when Christ returns? What happens to them? Change. Moment, twinkling of an eye, not going to die, we shall be changed. So there are a lot of people there that don't die ever once. And the saints who enter the millennium from the tribulation, at the end of this tribulation period, there are going to be enough saints to be populating the earth, and they are entering into a state where people just keep on living and living and living and living. And so probably a whole lot of them don't die either. So that passage doesn't mean that everybody has to die. It's talking about the normal course of events. In the normal course of events, what happens? Men die, then the judgment. Is it saying that absolutely every individual has to do that? No, clearly it's not saying that. So it doesn't have to be Enoch and Elijah. Another proposal is not, I didn't disprove that. Could be? Sure. Another proposal is Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah, the support. Both of them performed miracles like these do. Elijah called down fire from heaven and killed his opponents. These two were going to kill their opponents with fire. Moses turned water into blood. Elijah stopped the rain. How long did he stop it for? 3.5 years. These two are going to stop the rain for how long? 3.5 years. Malachi 4:5 says Elijah will return before the great and terrible day of the Lord. These two were seen at the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration was Christ, His glory. His glory talking about the millennial kingdom. When God brought two people back to represent Christ in His glory at the Mount of Transfiguration, who did He bring? Moses and Elijah. Both departed from earth in mysterious ways. Moses was taken out into a private place, and they couldn't even find his body later on. And Elijah, you know about the whirlwind and the chariot and that story. The drought in 11:6 is the same length as that which Elijah was in, he participated. Objection to Moses and Elijah. John the Baptist fulfilled the Elijah prophecy. Did he? He was here in the place of, as a likeness to Elijah. He was not actually Elijah. He was here, John the Baptist, to satisfy the offer that was made. It could have been establishing the kingdom, because there was an Elijah figure here, but he was not the actual Elijah. And if the actual Elijah had been brought, he'd be premature. We need to save him for the tribulation later on. And when Elijah returns, he's supposed to restore all things. That's going to occur in Elijah's return. It did not occur at John the Baptist's return. Moses did die. Therefore, it can't be Moses, because no one can die twice. Can't be Moses. He died. But then, what about Lazarus? Anybody going to say he's still around? I think he died twice. What about the widow's son whom Jesus raised? You remember? They were on their way out of town with a funeral procession, and this guy was dead. Jesus raised him from the dead. You think he died again? I think it's highly probable that he did. So, it could very well be Moses and Elijah. Or it could be just two men who only resemble Elijah and Moses. But could is not would. So, maybe not. You know what I think? I think it's Moses and Elijah. I think that's the strength of the argument here. They're going to preach repentance and prophesy. And they minister for 1,260 days. It's the time the holy city is trampled down. And it's also the time when the beast from the sea has authority. Revelation 13:5, there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies. And authority to act for 42 months was given to him. So the beast is given authority for 42 months. And these two people work, minister, do what they're supposed to do for the same 42 months. Now, I went a little bit over because I wanted to fill in the gap for time on the tape, and you had to sit for a few extra minutes. Questions?
We've gone through 42 months.
Mm-hmm.
There's 42 months left in the 7 years.
Yes.
If they come in at the midpoint, at the end of 42 months, they still have 3.5 days. We'll say that's negligible. They go up. But we still have, from that point forward, the 7th trumpet, the 7 bowls.
Mm-hmm.
And they appear, at least looking ahead, they appear to come after this time.
Yeah.
Because of the way it says the second woe is past, behold, the third woe is coming. And it seems sequential. How do we reconcile that to the 7 years?
I don't think it is sequential.
Okay.
I think that what we've got here is an intermission to talk about some other things that are not in the sequence of events. Sequence of events stopped with the 6th trumpet,
Okay.
when it was completed. And the only way I know to make it make sense is all these things are happening in parallel for the entire period of time, from then until the end of the tribulation. Father, thank you for the privilege of coming together and studying your word. Blessed are our hearts, and Father, make it practical in our lives as we consider these things which are coming, and how terrible and how awesome they are. Help us to serve you in the realization that you are the same God today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.